Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our service, I'm going to kindly ask that we turn off or silence all cell phones, electronic devices. Thank you.
Good morning. I know Rabbi Davies and I both feel very honored to be able to join with you this morning to pay Kavod Achron, final honor in this world, for Mrs. Ryfka Finkelstein, Ryfka Bas Ruvain. Begin with Psalm 23. Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai Roi, Lo Echsar, Bino Hosteshe, Yarbitzeini, Awalmei, Menuchos Yenahaleini, Nafshi Yeshovev, Yancheni b'maglei tzedek, Yancheni b'maglei tzedek, Oleman shemo, Gam ki eleich, Begeit Somoves, Lo ira robo, Ki ata imodi, Shivtecha mishantecha, Heima yenachamuni, Taroch lefanai shulchan neged tzorirai, Tishanta Bashemen Roshi, Kosi Rivaya, Achto Vachesed, Yirdefuni, Kohol Yemei Chayai, Aho Vishavti, Beveis Adonai, Liorech Yomim.
Now recite Psalm 23 in English. A song of David, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not lack. God causes me to lie down in lush pastures. God leads me beside tranquil waters. God restores my soul and guides me in the righteous path for God's name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your scepter and staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in full view of my adversaries. You have anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. May only goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for length of days. It is only befitting the matriarch of a family, matriarch of a community, to recite the Eshet Chayil, prayer that we customarily say each Friday night to praise women of valor. Eshet Chayil mi imtza v'rachok mipninim michra. A woman of valor, a gallant woman, who can find? Far beyond pearls is her worth. The text of Eshet Chayil contains so many beautiful verses, each one reflecting the qualities of an extraordinary life. While it would be fitting to go through the entire text, given the many speakers who will be sharing their memories and reflections this morning, I will instead focus on just a few verses to capture the essence of Ryfka Bas Ruvain, Mrs. Ryfka Finkelstein. Batach ba lev bala v'shala lo yechzar, gimelatu tov v'lo ra kol yemei chayaha. Her husband puts his confidence in her and lacks for nothing. She is good to him, never bad all the days of her life. This reflects the harmonious partnership that I never had the zechus, the merit, to witness firsthand, but I've heard about from so many between Yankel and Ryfka, as they were, as Pesha put it, very much on the same page in their dedication to our shul, to the community, to each other and their mission, their joint mission in life. V'takom ba'od laila v'titein teref leveita v'chok l'naroteha. She rises while it is still night and supplies provisions for her household, a daily fare for her maidens. She truly arose from the darkness of her past, providing light and sustenance not only to her family but to all those who needed her. Her resilience as a Holocaust survivor and her unwavering commitment to rebuilding a life full of generosity, of nurturing and care for others is a testament to her remarkable strength and values. Her love of hosting and ensuring that everyone, especially those singles, widows, and others, had a place at their Shabbat table, beautifully captured in these words. She nourished others both physically and spiritually. Kapa parsa la'ani v'yadeha shilcha le'evyon. She gives generously to the poor, and her hands are stretched out to the needy. The selfless generosity of that store, the store in the basement, to provide others for their needs they had to buy, but there was no cost. And especially their help that she had in resettling and helping Russian immigrants coming to the country and to the community. Oz v'hadar levusha v'tischak liom acharon. She is clothed with strength and splendor. She looks to the future cheerfully. Her strength, dignity, enduring commitment to attending services on Shabbat. We just saw her in shul. And always with a smile. Every time I saw her, every time we interacted, always with a smile. I remember not so long ago, we announced her 95th birthday in shul, which she did not want us to do. It seemed like she shrunk even more into her seat when we said it. But it was so beautiful to be able to celebrate her in a place she cherished so much, among the people who cherished her so much. Pia patcha v'chachma v'torat chesed al lishona. Her mouth is full of wisdom and her tongue with kindly teaching. The outreach that she and Yankel did together to bring others closer to Yiddishkeit, to Judaism, and her kindness to everyone that she met reflected the wisdom and loving guidance mentioned in this pasuk. Rabot banot asu chayil va'at alit al kulana. Many women have done well, but you surpass them all. The extraordinary impact that she made over a life so well lived. As Pesha shared with me, she made a mark on a lot of people through her dedication, her generosity, and her leadership. And then we conclude with the phrase, Tinula mipri yadeha v'halaluha b'sha'arim ma'aseha. Give her the fruits of her own hand, and allow her deeds to praise her in the gathering places. For in this moment, and in our tradition, we don't bury people. We lay bodies to rest. The container that held a person through their life. But each Jewish soul lives on. It lives on in the priyadeha, in the fruits of her labors of her hand that we see here before us in children, grandchildren, and a legacy that she left for all of us that we will carry on forever.
Thank you, Rabbi Davies. In the spirit of Eishes Chayil towards the conclusion, it states, Kamu voneha v'yashrua, her children will rise and praise her, Bala v'yahalala, and her husband will also extol. So at this point, I'm going to call up they'll come up individually when it's time for them to speak. Shlomo, Barbara, and Pesha.
Thanks, Rabbi. In reminiscing over my mother, Ryfka Finkelstein's life, 3 separate histories form in my mind. The first are stories that have been told to me and my 3 sibling sisters through my mother about her miraculous survival during the Shoah. I still can't comprehend to this very day how she was able to survive the onslaught of the Nazi war machine, death machine. As told, if it wasn't for the benevolent concern of Pani Bushko, one of the Polish righteous Gentiles, Mama would never have survived the winter of 1943. Pani gave my mother and her brother Anshel shelter in a barn filled with straw that was to be their bedding. If the Nazis discovered Jews hidden by any Polish Christians, Pani, her husband, and her 6 children under the age of 13 would have been murdered along with the Jews that were kept hidden. On April 20th, 1998, both my mother and father left JFK Airport on Flight 7, LOT Polish Airlines, from New York to Warsaw. Their mission was to thank the surviving righteous Gentiles who kept her and her brother hidden and safe in their homes and barns between 1942 and April 1944. In an article written about this trip to Poland on NYC Ghostwriter by my sister Broche, my mother made this toast to her rescuers, first in English and then in Polish. Raising a glass of sok, which is juice, in her right hand she said, "After the war, we never had a chance to say thank you. When everything was over, we all ran in different directions. Me, my brother, and you and your family. Now we are all together. I want to say thank you to you and to Pan Mushalo. His soul is with us forever. Together." As Brucha's tour guide and friend Tomek would say in his ironic voice, a stone would cry. Both my parents would send money and care packages over the years to various Polish families that helped save their lives during the Holocaust. At Yad Vashem, Israel Holocaust Memorial is one of those non-Jewish individuals that's been honored for risking their lives to aid and save the Jews. Now, the second of my mother's histories involved coming to a small country farm in Atco, New Jersey, where raising and eventually processing chickens became a way of life. But even though there were hardly any Jewish families in the area, my mother always kept kosher. There were separate dishes for meat and milk, and even during the Passover holidays, separate dishes as well. And I still fantasize over nibbling on the crust of that delicious sponge cake Mama used to bake. And those latkes were to die for, but not so much for the boiled chicken was pretty much a staple of that daily sustenance. While keeping Shabbos in our younger years, as a family, we'd all sit down on several outdoor benches after having taken a long walk on the farm and just soak up the midday sun, assuming, of course, that the weather cooperated. Now, I don't mean to paint an idyllic picture here, but considering what both parents went through before coming to America, somehow were they able to lead somewhat normal lives. Now, the happiest part of Mama's history is a third history. This was the move to 719 Cooper Landing Road in Cherry Hill. Both Mama and Papa were in heaven once I found out a synagogue, Congregation Sons of Israel, existed right across the street from where they were going to build a house and live there. When both parents settled in and going to services became a daily ritual. Now, over the years, the Finkelstein made many friends, and not only in the Jewish community, but some of the non-Jewish families in the neighborhood as well. And not so much because of Mama's freshly baked pastries that she called gebeks, but rather because of their good nature and unselfish help that was given to those in need, especially to the Soviet Jews that emigrated to the United States in the 1980s and came to Cherry Hill area. At times, I try to follow in both my father's and mother's footsteps. Believe me, it's a tough act to follow. Thanks.
When I was just sitting here now, I realized I have a cough drop, a tissue, and my glasses exactly like my mother. I did have something written, but as my brother indicated, I'm a writer, and I already rewrote it. So if you knew my mother, you knew 1939 was the most consequential year of her life. She and her family were lucky enough to have been conquered by the Soviets and not the Germans, Nazis. And she had about a year of relative peace. Then in June 1941, the ceasefire between the Soviet Union and Germany ended. In May 1942, the Germans overran my mother's shtetl at dawn, collected as many Jews as they could find, and shot them to death. How did my mother survive? Her father had the foresight that very morning to send her on an errand to buy lima beans. My mother, who was 14, wasn't home and missed the roundup. She survived an additional roundup, survived the Polish forests in every kind of weather, and I'm skipping over a lot of trauma and grief, ultimately ended up in New Jersey raising chickens with my father. Not long ago, my mother told me she was very glad that the work on the farm was hard. If I had time to think, I'd have lost my mind, she said. I saw my mother just last week on Thanksgiving Day, along with my brother Sal and sister-in-law Anita. Mama actually seemed okay. I remember thinking, she's going to make it to 100. And I told her I would come for a Shabbos in December. Brushka, she said, as my father called me, my door is always open. When I arrived this Sunday night, the door was locked. I have a key, so before I drove over to Jefferson Hospital, I went in. I was struck by how much my mother, no longer alive, was still in the house. The refrigerator had her challah and strudel in it, the leftover turkey from Thanksgiving that my brother and sister-in-law made was still in it. The diced carrots and celery for her vegetable soup were in the freezer. Her red cane was crooked on the banister. Her knitting projects were in between the two sofas. And inside a cupboard, as I think everyone in my family could attest, there was a little mountain of toilet paper and paper towels, all bought with coupons she clipped. They were eternally in place. And it seemed to me my mother had every intention of getting tuned up, as my father would have said at the hospital, before coming home to pick up where she'd left off. Here was her life in progress, or as we say in Yiddish, in mittendrin. No matter how normal the house looked, for me it was always 1942 there. One time, about 30 years ago, I came for Shabbos. I wasn't even in the door when my mother started telling me about an incident during the Holocaust. I realized then, I think, that her constant talking about the war was a way of managing her trauma. It kept her, and my father, who did the same thing, sane. But as I like to say a little bit flippantly, the constant remembering made me crazy. And that's why I love the feeling in the house this Sunday. Everything was so wonderfully normal, so material. The Holocaust survivor, the baker, the knitter, the coupon clipper, each incarnation of my mother remains a mystery to me. Sometimes I'd stare at her when I thought she wasn't looking, and I'd think, where did you come from? How far back do your ancestors go? Why do you look the way you look? How much of me is you? And it's always mystified me how you could be a child in your parents' home and never figure out why they were the way they were. Even at 71, I'm still trying to understand who Ryfka Finkelstein was. This despite my having heard her tales of survival hundreds of times. I was always struck by the solid impression she made on other people, especially my friends. The last of them to see my mother was Sarah Bennett, once a criminal defense attorney and now photographer. She drove from Brooklyn to Cherry Hill about a year ago to photograph my mother for the Lonka Project. And this is an Israel-based photographic tribute to the last living Holocaust survivors all around the world. And you can see Sarah's photo on the Platt website. Yesterday, Sarah left me this voicemail. I'm so sorry about your mom. It kind of hit me hard. That time I met her was just so amazing. You know how moved I was by being in her presence. I know she was a complicated person, but to me she wasn't complicated. She was just so resilient and full of forward thinking in terms of life. From Alan Suprainer, my pickleball partner, who had major heart surgery at age 14 and who misses his parents every day. Having seen the photos of your parents less than a week ago made them so present for me. And from my friend Peter Wertzman, who's struggling with Parkinson's disease. In words, we retrieve all the missing pieces and reassemble the puzzle of our life. There is a kind of immortality in memory. My mother, whoever she was, will achieve immortality, at least for me, by being one of the missing puzzle pieces I will ponder for as long as I live.
There's going to be a little repetition here, so my apologies in advance. So if you were sleeping through my siblings' speeches, you're going to hear it again. So many of you know my mother's stories of surviving the Nazi terror of World War II and losing her family, home, and all that was familiar. After that struggle, she and my father, Yankel, came to New York to face more challenges of language, parnassa, housing, how to get things done in a new country, parenting, and community. After a couple of years in New York, they moved with 2 young children to a chicken farm in Atco, New Jersey for 5 years, is the story that I heard growing up. The chicken business is the kind of thing that immigrants do. You don't need a sophisticated command of English, and people will always eat chicken. Those 5 years became 30. My memories of living on a farm in South Jersey are often of my parents' struggle and our family's challenge of being observant Jews in a town with about 6 other Jewish families, none of whom was observant. So let me fast forward to my parents' life in Cherry Hill, which began in 1981. Their goal was to live near a shul so that my father would have a place to daven, pray. Both of my parents absolutely loved living here and being a part of Congregation Sons of Israel. When they saw the vacant lot of land on Cooper Landing Road, they envisioned building their home that close to the shul. From the start, they wanted to have guests for Shabbos, which they couldn't do back in Atco. Even before they had furniture in the house, and I'm not exaggerating, they started inviting guests. I remember at first that there would be a Baal Tshuva or 2, and over the years, they reached out to people who didn't always have their own happy Shabbos tables, widows and widowers, single people looking for a match. In the late 90s, when the Russian refugees started streaming out of the Soviet Union, my parents became instrumental in their absorption into Jewish life in Cherry Hill. My mother had learned the Russian language for the 2 years that she lived under Russian occupation, from 1939 to 1941, when she was about 11 to 13 years old. She didn't use Russian much for the decades since that early schooling, but when the immigrants came to Cherry Hill, her Russian language miraculously came back to her at about age 62. She was the one person in the SOI community who could speak Russian to the new immigrants, and she, along with my father, was involved with helping settle people into homes, get kosher dishes, arrange for their clothing and furniture and first jobs, take them to their appointments, and be the surrogate family so many of them thirsted for. My parents turned a downstairs room into a used goods store with typewriters, clothing, appliances, and furniture. And they made sure to have Russian language benchers in the house. And for many Shabbats over many years, Russian conversation was heard as often as English at the Shabbat table. Also, during her time in Cherry Hill, both of my parents spoke to school children about their Holocaust experiences, but my mother was the more eloquent one. Both of my parents regarded speaking to school children about anti-Semitism as part of their mission as survivors and their legacy to transmit to the next generation. I am grateful to Helen Kirschbaum, who is here today, director of the JCRC of Southern New Jersey's Esther Robb Holocaust Museum and Goodwin Education Center, for connecting both of my parents to hundreds, if not thousands, of students who knew very little of the Holocaust. The children of all ages would send thank you cards to my parents for sharing their experiences. And of course, my mother kept each one, and we have them still. From a couple of fifth graders. Dear Mrs. Finkelstein, I really appreciated you coming in our class and talking about your tragic life. I know it must have been very hard. I would cry every day if I was alive at the time of the Holocaust. Thanks again. Love, Lauren. And another one. Dear Ms. Finkelstein, thank you for visiting us last week. It took a lot of guts to tell us about your experiences. Was the Holocaust as dreadful as you said? I really don't hope so. I'm glad you survived the Holocaust. I have to go. Right back. Love, Ronnie. P.S. Here is a picture I made to remind you how it was like after the Holocaust. And the picture kind of looked like Carmen Miranda without the hat. Many of us can recite the Woman of Valor, Eshes Chayil, the proverb that we sing on Friday night. And the phrase that most suits my mother is that she never eats the bread of idleness. Lechem atzlut lo tochel. There is so much more I can say about my mother, but I will conclude with this, that she was always, always industrious. Even growing up, if she had a spare moment, she would pick up a broom to sweep the kitchen floor. And once when I was little, I counted 7 times that she swept the kitchen floor, and she always found more dirt to pick up with the dustpan. If she wasn't working, she was gardening, cooking, pickling, baking, sewing, hanging laundry, reading 3 Yiddish newspapers a day, and learning English too. In Cherry Hill, she, along with my father, in addition to hosting Shabbat guests, checked the Eruv every Friday morning for many years. And she also worked the shul's bingo tables when they had bingo in the shul, distributed Pesach packages, and stood by my father, as you recall, as he poured people their l'chaims during the Shabbat Kiddush. She cooked her own food and baked her own bread and strudel until her final week. She started knitting again in Cherry Hill, and my daughters always rave about their bubby socks. She made socks for everyone. And I recently learned she also made them for her friends' children and grandchildren too. And guess what I saw on her work table when I visited on Sunday morning, as you heard from my sister Barbara? A nearly completed pair of bubby socks for my husband Ira. All that was left was the toe of the second of the socks. So I will be looking for someone who can make those last few stitches. My father often said, "One mother can take care of 10 children, but 10 children can't take care of one mother." So true. And that is why I must mention some thank yous here to the people who helped take care of my mother. And I'm apologizing in advance. I'm certain I'm going to be leaving some people out, so forgive me. So thank you first and foremost to Jonas Oliver, our health aide of the last 3 years. Who was with Ma'am Ryfka to the very last moment. Your devotion and that of the relief aides, Alice and Maria, was heroic. Thank you to Sylvia and Stuart Levine for arranging for so many rides for doctor's appointments. Thank you, Fred Gross and Chaim Kress, for the weekly Sunday visits. My mother loved making matzah meal pancakes in advance of your visits. Thank you, neighbor Don Becker. He was always the neighbor. He wasn't just Don Becker. For your frequent visits, and to Jonathan Bender for your reliability in shoveling the driveway, walk, and steps over the years. And I heard today that his pay was also in Kreplach, not just in Strudel. Thank you, Dr. Panich, for the advice you offered this past Sunday when my text messages found you in the Lud airport in Israel and you called me back. Thank you, Sid Goldberg, for being that guy that every shul needs who knows everything about how things work. Thank you, family, for your wonderful children. You are all terrific, but honorable mentions go to grandchildren Nate and Max, who called Bubby just about weekly, and Hindi, who spent the past 2 summers with Bubby. Chaya for naming JJ after Zaidi Yankel. Tali, first great-grandchild, whose beautiful voice singing Manishtana on Pesach gave Bubby great nachas. Yisrael and Shana, Lev, Malka, Ellie, JJ, and Toby, thank you for being here and giving Bubby the greatest reward imaginable for surviving the Nazi nightmare. Thank you, sons of Israel, for being the focal point of my parents' life, of my mother's life, for the past 43 years. She always very keenly felt the loss of her early life, but she was so happy to have found her Jewish home here. She loved being a part of the shul, and as she aged, she regretted that she would no longer hear you well, or help with the kiddush, or go out to schools to speak with the children. I believe that the last time that she spoke to a class was last May when she came to the Politz school. She was completely overjoyed to see so many Jewish children learning in a Jewish school and carrying out our traditions forward. She said to them, "I love you all," and she meant it with all of her heart. May her memory be blessed. And I will now be followed by grandchildren. No, you are right before the rabbi. You want to go now? Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, 3 of the children. King Solomon also says, Ateres zekenim b'nei banim, which means that the crown of the elders are their grandchildren. And therefore it is my honor to call up at this time Shana, Nathaniel, and Max to share a few words.
Good morning. My name is Shana Cohen, and I'm Ryfka's oldest granddaughter. It's dawning on me that I'm older now than she was when I was born, which is hard to wrap my mind around. When someone lives such a long and full life, it's hard to imagine the world without them. And what I want to emphasize most that hasn't already been said is that my Bubby was part of my earliest understanding of what it meant to be loved and cherished. And I think we can all, as grandchildren, remember somebody who was so all-encompassing in her warmth. She had so many terms of endearment for all of us, and they would get rattled off in succession in Yiddish every time we saw her. She was always full of stories, folk stories. We've all heard the Jabgala and the Babgala story, and she was always full of music. I remember her voice so clearly singing lullabies, wordless and Yiddish, all through our earliest years. When I was very young, my parents had a tradition of exchanging cassette tapes because we lived in Atlanta, Georgia by that point, so she was far away. And so my parents would record me singing and send it to her, And then she would always send a tape back, and both sides of the tape were filled with her just reading stories and singing songs. Our summers were always spent either with her here in Atlanta or with us, either up in Atco or later in Cherry Hill. And I have many memories of driving down in Zadie's giant car to Atlantic City or out to the farm where they would still go to get fresh produce. I think being the third generation out from the Holocaust means that you get to have a different relationship with the survivors in your family. It's a little less intense, it's a little less complicated, but you're still left with this overwhelming sense of miraculousness in your own existence. It's because of someone else's survival that you are here, someone else's perseverance and tenacity and just sheer good fortune. And so it was meaningful to me to be able to have Tali, my daughter, the oldest of the great-grandchildren of Ryfka and Yankel, be able to sit with my bubby. And even though many of her storytelling, prodigious storytelling faculties had diminished by that point, she was still able to transmit a lot of those stories to Tali. So Tali is one more link in the chain. And all of my brothers and my cousins' children are one more link in the chain back to this extraordinary person and couple that did everything they could to make the American dream possible for their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandkids. I'll just say one more thing. I do a lot of B'nai Mitzvah tutoring in my hometown shul in Atlanta, and I frequently talk with the kids about the first part of the Shmona Esrei, the standing prayer, which is all about recognizing Jewish ancestry, the Avot ve'imot, our matriarchs and patriarchs from the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. And I talk to the kids frequently about what it means to remember one's ancestors. Why are these people who lived so long ago so important to our own lives? What can they still say to us that feels relevant? And the kids don't always know, but I think it's an important question to ask every generation. What does this person's life mean to you? And I know that for all of my cousins, my brother, and for all of our kids, Bubby's life, Zadie's life will continue to echo down through the ages, and we're honored to be part of their legacy. Thank you.
All right. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Max, and I am the youngest of Bobby Ryfka and Zadie Yankel's grandchildren. And as sort of as my parents, my mother and my parents' generation alluded to, you know, their childhood on the farm wasn't always idyllic. But as the youngest grandchild, for me, Bubby and Zadie's home was idyllic. It was the place to be. It was the most warm and welcoming place in the entire world. It was a place where I would arrive and instantly would be greeted by my Bubby and my Zadie. Maxunyale's here. And the smells that would come out of the kitchen, whether it was latkes or kreplach, there was always food. And whether I said I was hungry or not, it didn't matter. Because even if I had just finished a plate of kreplach, Maxale, you need to eat. You need to eat. And it was incredible. And there are a couple of themes I kind of want to talk about. And that first one that sort of my Bubby represents is family. And it was a place where all of us, you know, we were all spread out through different places, New York, Atlanta, New Jersey, and then as we got older, Israel, New York, Seattle, Los Angeles, San Francisco, etc. And it was always this focal point that we could all come back to, and we would all be together, and even as adults, we'd come back, and we'd be instantly transported back to that feeling with the smell of the kreplach and the soup and the gebeks that everybody's talked about. And we'd be a family together, and it was really amazing. And it's something that I would see in my Bubby's eyes and my grandfather when he was alive as well, that it's something that they missed from their childhood that obviously with the Shoah was taken away from them. And this was sort of tying the knot on their entire life and showing that we can rebuild and have a beautiful family. And then, of course, the next generation, the great-grandchildren, who are continuing the torch and carrying that further. So family is one amazing theme that has sort of always been sort of the focal point of my Bubby and Zadie's house. But there are two other things that I also want to talk about, and that is the inspiration that I got for chesed. For deeds of kindness. My mom and her siblings have already talked quite a bit about that, and it's something that has really inspired my entire life and has pushed me on the path that I've been growing up, and almost through, osmosis, just sucking it in without even realizing it, just being there and seeing the dozens of guests. When I'm a little kid, when I'm 5 years old, I just saw a bunch of, old people who were probably younger than I am now, wandering around my grandparents' house while my cousin Yisrael and I were just trying to play magic cards on the floor. But I didn't understand it as a kid, but as I got older, I understood that my grandparents had dedicated their lives to helping whenever they could with whatever they could. And if I can even do a small percentage of the good deeds and kindness and chesed that they've done, I will be a very, very successful man. And I think that is really the legacy of my Bubby Ryfka, and both of my grandparents for my generation and the great-grandchildren. And I did say that there was a third theme, but while I'm standing here, I can't remember what it was, which is, it must have been important. But I will just talk one last bit about the food, because that's something that everybody also has touched on. And that was, I guess in the parlance of our times, that was my Bubby's love language, food. And obviously there's something, that goes all the way back to her experience during the Holocaust. But from the moment we would arrive, my cousins and I, and every generation of her kids, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, the moment we would arrive, there would be food on a plate ready for us, whether it was latkes, whether it was blintzes, whether it was, like my Uncle Shlomo said, the chicken wasn't so hot, but everything else was amazing, and I think it's something that my cousins and I all still talk about, and it's almost become this like idealized thing, Bubby's soup and Bubby's kreplach, and it's just an amazing memory because it all represents home, and that was also how, like I said, with the chesed, how she and my grandfather really helped the community. And, I think every single person here has probably had a kreplach or a challah roll or gebeks, and then another piece and another piece, even if you didn't want any more. So anyway, I missed my Bubby, but in our generation and in the great-grandchildren, we're going to carry the torch forward and continue her and my grandfather's legacy.
I like the chicken. Growing up, whenever there was a need, Bubby was the cavalry. Kids got chicken pox, Bubby was on a plane. Parents going on an extended vacation, Bubby was there. And of course, there were countless requests from us kids as well. Bubby, the cat has found a snake. You need to save her. And Bubby did save the cat. She got out a giant stick, and I was probably about 4 years old, and so this snake is probably 10 feet long. And she picked up the snake and flung it right back in the woods. She's fearless. You saved the cat. You remember that? Yeah. When I was a child, I loved talking with Bubby on the phone. And she would tell me about her garden and the plants that she cared for. And once about a friendly rabbit that kept visiting her garden. And to a 5-year-old, the rabbit was really the stuff of legends. I begged her to catch it, and to send it in the mail. And I assured her, falsely, that my parents had agreed to this. And she set up a trap. And she checked it daily, and she would report back to me, "Nah, sorry, we didn't get anything this week." I built a little wooden cage for it. It was not of sufficient quality to take care of a rabbit, but she did it. She really cared. She really thought, well, of course, my grandson asked me to do it. Now that I'm a father, Bubby had continued to be a constant presence in our lives. She'd been logging on the computer and visiting us weekly through Google Hangouts. In fact, she was actually much more technically savvy than a lot of the people I work with. And whenever somebody was sort of struggling to log on, I would tell them truthfully, listen, my 95-year-old grandmother does not have a problem with this. It's really more of a testament to her prowess than their deficiencies. So for the last 4 years, every week, she signs on, she sings songs to us, checks to make sure that we're warm and that we're eating well, and she smiled as my son Ellie paraded his toys in front of the camera for her to see. These moments were incredibly special, especially during the COVID times. Bubby had a dream that she would talk about of a big piece of land where all of her family could live together, houses built side by side, everyone together, and that we've scattered across different places in the country. We've still honored that dream with this annual Pesach pilgrimage to Cherry Hill. And it was evident to all of us how she cherished those gatherings, sitting back and watching the family talk, the Kinderlach play and smile. And she had a smile. She had a smile that was unique to her journey as a Holocaust survivor. It was a smile of resilience and love and pride. I'm deeply sorry that she's missing this gathering, but I can still feel her smile as she's brought us all here again today. So thank you, Bubby, for everything. You are deeply loved, and we will forever carry you with us.
Deb, I think Elena's going to go first. You know, there are a lot of words that can describe Ryfka Finkelstein. Google Hangouts wasn't one I was expecting, nor was I able to see in my mind's eye her picking up that snake. But you learn something new every day, and it's very common for family to be able to share reflections. At this time, I'm going to call up somebody who's like family, and I think she represents so many who have been touched by Yankel and Ryfka throughout the years, and it's somebody who I'm very, very happy to be able to call up right now, and that's my friend and my neighbor, Elena Cohen.
I first met Mrs. Finkelstein when I was very young in Shul, when my parents introduced me to her. We had an immediate connection. From that point on, we would sit next to each other in Shul, and I always felt that sitting next to a true tzaddikas, that I had the best seat in Shul. I remember afterwards, my father and I would go to visit her regularly at her house. Spending time with Mrs. Finkelstein was a true pleasure for me. Her beautiful kindness and love for Judaism always shined through. During these visits, especially the one last Shabbos, she taught me valuable life lessons. One of the biggest topics that she taught me was to never lose faith. She lived through so much. As you've heard, She survived 2 winters outside in a barn under a pile of straw without shoes or even a sweater. Through all of this, she never lost her Jewish faith. She always had hope and emunah in Hashem that she would be okay. I could see that others in her position could have given up, but not her. If she could hold on to faith through all of this, surely we can have faith through our challenges too. One more thing I would like to mention is a lot of people pray for miracles and search everywhere for one. But for me, meeting Mrs. Finkelstein and hearing her story is the only miracle I have needed. She was a true inspiration for me. I already miss her and will remember her always.
Thank you, Elena. And for the final family speaker, we call upon Deb.
So I'm Dvoirel. I'm the oldest. Ordinarily, I would have been the first speaker, but I asked to be the closer because we all have so many different stories about my mother, and the stories all represent different facets of her being. And then there is the overstory. So when the COVID lockdown happened, and I was talking to my mother, and she was making fun of people who complained about having to shelter in place and being locked down. And she would say, "Do you know how long I had to wait to be liberated? 3 years." And that was normal for my mother because she saw life through the template of the Chorban. I don't know when we started calling it the Shoah, but we grew up with the Chorban as the word for the Holocaust. So how could she not have that incredible early childhood event be the template that she saw the world through? So maybe in the 70s, 80s, we started talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And before that, it existed. We just didn't give it a name. And we kind of, I think a culture had a sense, if you don't talk about it, it'll be okay. So when my parents came over and wanted to talk about their experiences, they were encouraged not to because it would stress the children. And, don't talk about it and you'll get over it, which was incredibly bad advice. But that was the 50s, the 60s. That's kind of how we lived our lives, which was take a huge plunger and just plunge it down. So how could they not, both my parents, come through the Shoah without trauma? And as I've heard everyone else talk, we didn't get together beforehand. We never rehearse. And in all our stories, we have a recognition of the trauma that our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents lived through. So what happens when you experience that kind of awfulness, it leaves wounds both on your body and on your soul. And for my mother, she had immense anxiety. The Yiddish phrase is "Sorg sich nicht," don't worry about it. That had no meaning for my mother. So whatever was going on, she worried. And it took me a while to recognize how much of her worry was about separation anxiety. When you are a little kid and you lose your mom at about 12, well, that's a big loss. And then at 14, you go off to buy beans and you come back and everybody is dead. So that kind of fear of separation, fear of loss, drove my mother's decisions. She made her decisions based on anxiety and not so much thinking about long-term consequences. And so the 30 years my parents spent on the farm in Atco, New Jersey, there were 30 more years of being in hiding. And then they moved to Cherry Hill, and they moved to Sons of Israel, and all the growth, personal development that had been arrested stopped. It's like somebody took a finger off the pause button, and they were able to resume growing, living a life, living a Jewish life, living a communal life. And without a doubt, these were the happiest years of their lives. So, PTSD is not really the story, nor the Shoah. That's not really the story either for my mother. The story is about transcendence, about my mother defeated Hitler because living well is the best revenge. My mother went to school until about the 5th grade. My mother spoke and wrote and read 7 languages. It was imperative for her that all her children go to college. Didn't even occur to me that not all girls were supported in going to college during my era, because it wasn't even a question. We all went to college. And we all had piano lessons. We all played musical instruments. Neither my mother nor father played anything. So, in listening to our stories, one of my mother's favorite things to do would be to look at a picture of all her family together or on a Zoom, and she would say, with great satisfaction, "All mine." And what she was saying is that we are her story, all of us together. Genetic family, neighborhood family, synagogue family, that we are her story.
Yasher Koach to the family, the generations, for sharing such love, warmth, respect, and stories. Some we knew, some we could intuit, and some we learned. Ryfka Bas Reuven. It's the end of an era. Over the last 25 years, we've been hearing over and over again that our survivors are advancing towards the next world, and soon we won't have living testimony of the Shoah. With the passing of Ryfka Bas Reuven Finkelstein, that time has come, at least I believe, in Sons of Israel, where Mr. and Mrs. Finkelstein were fixtures since the early 1980s. The only thing in life we know for sure is that tomorrow is going to be different than today. Time is special. That's why many times of the year the rabbis decreed that we should say Shehechianu, that we're happy to arrive at a time. Today we've reached a painful time, a tear-filled time, a time of reflection of beautiful soul that illuminated the world around her. You know, there's sometimes a mentality that you bump into where people say, no, she lived a good life, she lived to her upper 90s, she saw nachas from her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Azoi gaitus. This is the way of the world. People live and people die. That is not the Jewish way to look at things. As we saw in last week's Parsha Vayetze, Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva vayelech Harana. Jacob left Beersheva and went to Haran. Why does the Torah tell us that he left? Because when a tzaddik leaves, glory leaves, radiance leaves, beauty leaves, and it can never come back. Pana Hoda, Pana Ziva, Pana Hadara. What does that mean? Reb Eliyahu Mizrahi, the 15th century chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire, explains that Chazal to say that when we're around great people, we behave better. We feel better. We're nicer even to one another, because you got to behave. You're near Mrs. Finkelstein. When they leave, we lose that influence. Whom will Elena sit next to in shul next time she goes? When being around Mr. and Mrs. Finkelstein, it was very hard not to smile and feel good. That warm and exuberant greeting on the phone or in person, it was an instant pickup. Hello? The Talmud in Yuma 35b asks and mentions that at the end of days, when anyone goes up to heaven, they're going to ask us questions. One of them is, did you study Torah in your lifetime? And some people might say, well, no, I had to make a living. I was too poor. I didn't have time. And the Talmud says, Hillel mechayev aniyim. There was no one poorer than Hillel. Some people are going to say, I had too many properties, I had too much going on, and the Talmud says, Rebbe Elazar ben Charsom was Mechayev Ashirim. Rebbe Eliezer had so much wealth, but he made time. And then some people are going to say, well, I had too much of a social life. People were into me. I didn't have time. And the Talmud says, Yosef, Mechayev Tarashoim. Yosef gives the responsibility to even the most handsome and pretty people that they should take time as well. Another question they're going to ask when we get to heaven is Hamlachtecha Chaver. Did you serve your fellow mankind? Did you take care of people? And people are going to have excuses. They were too busy, they didn't know how, I had a hard life. Ryfka Finkelstein is mechayev everyone to be good to people. Because as we heard, she had a very hard life. But she and Mr. Finkelstein always took care of their fellow Yidden. I was told by Pesha that when she was brought to the hospital to take her vitals, she looked around to find the Jewish doctors to say how proud she was of them, a few hours before she went to heaven. She and Yankel had open hearts, an open home, an open bottle, an open seat for any and all guests that came to shul. They were our local living examples of Avraham Avinu and Sarah Imenu. How many guests came through their doors for Shabbos? How many challahs were baked and shared? How many people learned how to daven and were helped with Kaddish and shul? Pana Hoda, Pana Ziva, Pana Hadara. That's no longer here. Allow me to share one more memory as the hour is late. Over a decade ago, there was a fantastic Hachnasa Sefer Torah on Cooper Landing Road. We were marching all the way down to the Kollel. And we were coming down the road, and there were Mr. and Mrs. Finkelstein sitting on their porch. So I made sure that we made a detour and brought the Torah right past them. They not only got up to kiss the Torah, but the joy in their eyes and excitement and the smiles on their on their faces. The porch dancing was so euphoric. And I was thinking then, when Ryfka was 12, 14 years old, 15, and her father and sisters were killed and she went on the run for 2 years. If you would have said to her, one day you will live across the street from a shul and witness hundreds of proud Jews dancing down the street celebrating a new Torah, she wouldn't have believed you. It's hard to foresee it. As Deb mentioned, during COVID, when people complained, got depressed, frustrated, worried, she would say, you have a roof over your head? You have clothing and some food? What are you worried about? Be happy. Ryfka expressed such gratitude and wonder to Hashem and shared it with thousands of Jews throughout the years. I think it's safe to say that everyone here this morning has been inspired by something we learned or heard about Mr. Finkelstein and Mr. Finkelstein. Therefore, in her memory, let's pledge to take on something good that we can do to make the world a better place in her memory like she did. We are all truly fortunate and blessed to have known her and been touched by her. To her dear children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, we are with you. She was family to us, so that, of course, makes us family with you, too. Thank you for sharing her with us. May her memory always be for a blessing. Although the world feels a bit darker today, the sun didn't come out before we came, may the light she brought into this world continue to shine in you for generations to come until the coming of Mashiach, when we will reunite with her and Yankel again. Tehei nishmasa tzrura b'tzura chayim. May her soul be bound up for eternal life, and let us say, Amen. At this point, because Ryfka is of the concluding living survivors, I'd like to ask everybody to please rise. And before we say the Kel Mole in her memory, Rabbi Davies and I would like to sing together the Ani Mamin associated with the survivors in the Warsaw Ghetto. For those that are aware of the tune, please feel free to sing along. Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin, Be'emuna Shelema, Bevias HaMashiach, Bevias HaMashiach Ani Mamin, Bevias HaMashiach, Bevias HaMashiach Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin, Be'emuna Shelema, Bevias HaMashiach, Bevias HaMashiach Ani Mamin, Bevias HaMashiach, Bevias HaMashiach Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin, Be'emuna Shelema, Bevias Mashiach, B'vias HaMashiach ani ma'amin, V'yaf al pi sheyizmameya, im kol zeh achakelu. Ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin. We conclude with the memorial prayer, the Keil Malei Rachamim. El Malei Rachamim Shochein Bamiromim Hamitzei Menucha Nichona Al Kanfei Ashchina V'malos Kedoshim Utahorim Kizoar Harakia Masirim Es Nishmas Ryfka Bas Reuven Shalcha L'olamo Ba'avor Shanachnu Mispalelim Me'ar Haskaras Dishmaso Began Eden Temnu Chaso Lachein Bal Arachamim Yastireo B'seisek Knafav Loilamim V'yitzror B'tzorachayim Is Dishmaso Adonai Unachlaso V'sanuach Ha B'shalom Al Mishkavah V'nomar Amen.
God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant proper repose on the sheltering wings of your presence in the lofty levels of the holy and pure, who shine as the brightness of the firmament, unto the soul of Ryfka Bas Reuven, Ryfka Finkelstein, who has gone to her world and for whose memory we pray. May her repose be in paradise, and the Master of Compassion bring her under the cover of God's wings and bind her soul in the bond of life. May the Lord be her heritage, and may she rest on her resting place in peace. And let us say, Amen.
May be seated. The family will be sitting Shiva at 719 Cooper Landing Road, and the Minyanim will be in the shul.